My baby dolls, welcome back. Welcome back, as John Sebastian had wrote for Welcome Back, Carter. You are listening to Genesis, the new age of sports and entertainment podcasting. As always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz, and today, got another stellar show coming for you folks. We got Hal Bock and his wonderfully new book, Banned, Baseball's Blacklist of All-Stars and also Rans. And we're going to get to Hal and the book in just a few minutes, but of course you are listening to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with the Zigzag Man, Ralph Tycho, and of course programming is increasing ever on the network. We now have Mark Weiss and Mark Little. Again, if you don't know who Mark Little was, he played in Major League Baseball for about 10 years, most famous giving up the home run to Chris Chambliss in the 1976 American League Championship Series, which gave the Yankees the pass to the World Series, something they didn't do in 12 years. It kind of feels that way with the Yankees now, that they haven't gone to the World Series in 8 years. But that's another time, and that's another story. But you got me on the show with Alan Blumkin and David Nemec, and David Nemec's old-time baseball and trivia. And I do the Giants both in New York and San Francisco with the Zigzag Man himself, Ralph Tycho. I'm honored to be on both of those programs, in addition to having my own program, and a lot of baseball knowledge is being expressed to you folks. The learning continues. That's what I'm here for, and that's what all these great authors are here for as well. So we turn to Hal Bock's book, Banned, and of course he has a great book here. It's Pete Rose is in the book, Marge Schott, George Steinbrenner. We go way back into 1800s ball. We go through the Chicago Black Sox scandal, everything to Leo DeRocha, and of course we had Paul Dixon on the show earlier this season, talking about his new book on Leo the Lip DeRocha. It's a very, very, very deeply detailed book. It's not a large read. I advise everybody to go out and put this on their shelf, not only to be read, but as a reference, because I think what Hal did in Appendix 1 to give all the folks that had lifetime bans, and then 2 to cite Major League Rule 21 misconduct, has to be on your shelf when you're analyzing stuff like banning a player or a general manager or the whole steroids things. This is a good reference book to pick up, as well as learning the history of those who were banned. And I can't get enough of the book, and it's for me. I've analyzed so much, and we're going to get into the discussion of Pete Rose, and even then it brings a lot of questions. Now, who's Hal Bock? Well, if you don't know who Hal Bock is, he's been around since 1963, I believe. He's an award-winning sports writer and columnist at the Associated Press for 40 years, covering every major event on the sports calendar, including 30 World Series, 30 Super Bowls, and 11 Olympic Games. He has written scores of magazines articles and is the author of 16 books, including the recently published The Last Chicago Cubs Dynasty Before the Curse. And I'm going to try to get Hal back for that, as well as the narratives for the Complete Encyclopedia of Ice Hockey, the Associated Press's Pictorial History of Baseball, and Willard Mullen's Golden Age of Baseball Drawings, which came out before this book, another great book that anyone really who was into cartoons, and I was a huge Bill Gallo fan in New York, especially with General von Steinbrenner all those years that I lived in New York. He has also taught journalism at St. John's University and Long Island University, and he currently lives on the island with his wife, who is a retired psychologist, and their cat, a rescued stray. And welcome to the show, sir. How are you, Hal?
Thanks very much, Ian. That's very nice. Good to be with you.
It's always good to be with you. You wrote a stellar book. And, by the way, for those of you we're taping this May 11th. It is Hal's birthday, so I want to give you a happy birthday from the network as well.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it.
And to share it, now let me ask you this. I love the forward of this book, and I love the fact that you mention, but don't go into detail, about the Tris speaker, Ty Cobb, whole scandal that occurred. Now, I had Gerald Wood on my show a few months ago, and I socked to him saying, why didn't you talk about this scandal? Because this scandal is probably the third biggest scandal when you look back on history in baseball, besides Rose and besides the White Sox. And out of it was codified Major League Baseball Rule 21, like you mentioned, although Landis was probably following each and every one of these rules since he came in 6 years earlier. But why do you think this affair is so forgotten that no book has ever been written on the subject?
Well, it's an interesting question. You have to keep in mind that neither of those players was banned, and both of them were the greatest stars of their time. I mean, they were obviously Hall of Fame players and major stars in that time. So, sure, there was some investigation and there was some suspicion, but neither of them was banned from baseball. So people kind of put it to the side. The people who were banned in those days, some of them were stars, but not great stars. The White Sox, the Black Sox actually, the 1919 World Series. One of the players who was banned was a guy named Joe Jackson, Shoeless Joe Jackson. He was probably the biggest star of that period who got himself banned. But other than him, the rest of those guys were kind of really good players, but not great players, and not Hall of Fame players. Tris Speaker and Ty Cobb were Hall of Fame players. So baseball in that era treaded a little bit lightly when it came to those guys. When it came to other guys, many of whom are in my book, the hammer came down rather quickly, rather swiftly, and permanently. So that was the difference.
And right now I'm doing research on it because Gerald Wood asked me right on live air. He said, hey, would you like to write the book about it with me? I'm like, sure, I'd be honored with it. But I'm going to tell you something right now. Landis, when he came in, along the lines, like you said, it would be a tragedy to keep Speaker and Cobb off to throw them out of baseball. Both of them resigned. Both of them were player managers. Both of them resigned due to Van Johnson. And Dutch Leonard, who was the one who told Van Johnson about this, was paid $20,000 for two letters that both Speaker and Cobb denied. Smokey Joe Wood was in on this, said that Ty Cobb never gave up a cent. Cobb went on the offensive with lawyers, and then Van Johnson passed this. Actually, he paid $20,000 to keep this shut. Landis got word of it, released it to the press. Johnson's career was finished, but Dutch Leonard refused to testify. And so when that happened, Landis threw the stuff out, and both Speaker and Cobb were exonerated. But this goes against what he did 6 years ago. Anyone with even an inkling of betting on baseball would be thrown out. And he softened his stance, as you mentioned, because they were both superstars. But the 1919 Black Sox were acquitted. Why didn't Landis take heed of the acquittal, especially with the missing evidence and, the fact that the grand jury just said, the heck with it. You're not guilty.
He came in, he was charged with cleaning up baseball because the 1919 Black Sox were by no means the only team that was tinted with scandal. And the only players who were tinted with scandal. Everybody was fixing games in those days. Everybody was throwing games. Bribes were everywhere. And as far as the Black Sox were concerned, they were only the tip of the iceberg. And Major League Baseball, the owners, decided that if their sport was going to survive and thrive, they were going to have to clean it up. So they hired this federal judge, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who was a stern, no-holds-barred kind of a judge, and put him in place. And so he decided he was going to clean up baseball once and for all. So the most minor infractions that came to his desk, 9 times out of 10, he threw the guy out of baseball. And it was kind of crazy, really. He was throwing people out left and right for the most minor offenses. But he was the czar. He was the chairman of the board. He was the commissioner. And he set the standard, and many of those players were barred from baseball for simple things like holding out for a better contract. You're barred. You're out of the game. Get out. And so it was a little bit of a crazy time in the history of the commissioner's job. But he was lauded for cleaning up the game. He cleaned it up with a very strong hammer that came down on many of the players, some of whom couldn't believe that they had been barred from baseball.
And one of those guys that he barred, which I love the story of Benny Kauf. Let's speak about Benny Kauf. You see, that's the good thing. That's the good thing, Hal. We go from one thing into another. Just flows right in with Landis, you know?
Benny Kauf was he was a showman. He was very taken with himself. He was a very handsome guy, dressed very fancy dress, and he had no concern for contracts. He moved from team to team whenever he felt like it. And one of the teams he moved to the Federal League. A Federal League was an outlaw league that challenged Major League Baseball in the 1914, 1915 in there. And it raided Major League Baseball and got quite a few of the major players to come over and play for it. And in fact, Judge Landis was involved in the demise of the Federal League because he refused to take up their antitrust charge against Major League Baseball. It was like a pocket veto, and the Federal League eventually went out of business after 2 seasons. Benny Kauf had played in the Federal League. He was one of the great stars of that league, and he led the league in stolen bases both years that he played. He came back to play for the New York Giants, and while he was playing for the Giants, he found himself involved, peripherally at least, in a stolen car ring. So he went from stolen bases to stolen cars, which I always was charmed by. And Judge Landis got wind of this, and even though he was found innocent in court, considered to be an innocent bystander, drawn in by people he knew and hung out with, Judge Landis wasn't having any of that, and he just barred him from baseball. And that's the tragedy of Benny Kauf. Even though he was a pretty good player and very, very taken with his own importance and his own image, he got himself thrown out of the game by the commissioner. So the commissioner was an equal opportunity commissioner. If you crossed his desk and you crossed him, you were likely to get yourself kicked out of the game.
Yeah, Landis definitely, and I think, you know, when we speak about Landis, he is such a, and when you really dig deep into it, he's such a man of contradictions when you look at it, for ignoring some, really laying down the law with others, and especially on the race issue, it's unclear because he didn't harbor integrating the game. I think it was still the owners that believed that the game should remain segregated, but still it's a black mark on Landis that when he had the opportunity to do it, he didn't do it. I think Bill Veeck wanted to integrate.
He did.
During the war. He tried to buy the
Phillies,
I think.
The interesting thing, Ian, Happy Chandler was the commissioner of baseball for a short time from 1947 after Landis had passed away till 1951, 4 years. And Chandler had his own history of barring people from baseball. But one of the people he didn't bar was Jackie Robinson. But Branch Rickey went to Chandler and asked his position on adding Jackie Robinson. And to his credit, even though Chandler is viewed as kind of a lightweight commissioner, to his credit, Chandler gave the green light to Branch Rickey and the Brooklyn Dodgers to sign Jackie Robinson, and that was a turning point not only in baseball but in the nation, in the history of America. This was a major thing, and Chandler. It's interesting because Chandler, in just that short time that he was commissioner, he was barring people left and right. He threw Leo DeRocher out of the game for a year simply because he didn't like the people that Leo was hanging around with, including Broadway and Hollywood actors and so forth. That crowd. He had what they called the Mexican jumping beans. There was a Mexican league owner, who decided he was going to challenge Major League Baseball, and went after some of the great stars of the day. He went after Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth said, "Take a hike. I'm not coming to play. I'm not going to be the president of the Mexican League." He went after Ted Williams. He went after Joe DiMaggio. Now, he got some people to go. He got some people to jump. Max Lanier, who was a really good pitcher in those days, went to the Mexican League. So did Mickey Owens. So did Luis Olmo, the outfielder who just died a few days ago in his 90s. He jumped from the Dodgers. So all these players, about 20-some players who jumped to the Mexican League. Sal Maglie, the great Giants pitcher, was one of them. Danny Gardella, another outfielder who jumped to the Mexican League. And Chandler was faced with this challenge, and he barred them all from baseball. So here you have Happy Chandler barred Leo DeRocher, and he barred 20-some Major League players who jumped to the Mexican League in a very short period of time. And he also reinstated the Mexican League guys who came back and pleaded for a reinstatement, and he was granted reinstatement. So he had a very interesting chapter in the history of the game and in the history of players and others being banned from the game.
With Happy Chandler, and the reason why Chandler became the commissioners, because Landis had passed, I think, in '44. Now, this is very interesting when we mentioned DeRocher, because like I said earlier, I had Paul Dixon on the show. In 1942, DeRocher's name came across Landis's desk again, and it always did throughout the 20s and 30s anyway. But, the Brooklyn Dodgers were gambling, poker games, all this stuff, and he told General Manager Lee McPhail, get rid of DeRocher and all the gamblers. Get him out. But Lee McPhail did not do it. He kept DeRocher. And the rest of the Dodgers, pretty much all the gamblers were liquidated, according, as told by Landis, get the hell out. But DeRocher stayed. And now, on a less offense, say, just hanging out with Georgie Raft, who he had an apartment with, and, for those who don't know George Raft, excellent actor. I always tell people, if you want to see a great film and see Some Like It Hot, he spoofs himself playing Spats. But here's a less offense. He's hanging out with known gamblers, I think in Cuba. Wasn't it in Cuba? And,
yes.
And him and McPhail, who was on the Yankees by this time, McPhail was doing the same thing. But yet DeRocher got the suspension for a year.
Well, DeRocher was an easier target, really, for Happy Chandler. Larry McPhail was an executive, and you didn't throw out executive. Well, you did. I mean, they threw out Bill Cox for gambling. He was an owner, So, I mean, you did throw out executives now and then. But Leo was much more vulnerable because of his image, because of his persona. It was going back as far as the 1927 Yankees. Leo was a teammate of Babe Ruth, and Babe accosted him and said, that he had stolen Babe's watch out of the locker room. So Leo had a kind of a negative image right along, and it was easy. He was an easy target to get rid of because of his image. MacPhail was, a little crazy, but he was an executive, and they treaded a little lightly in that area, I think. So that's why Leo got himself kicked out, because he had a history.
Now, coincidentally, with DeRocha and MacPhail, at the time, DeRocha was lobbying. He was very vocal on bringing Jackie in. He told anyone in the Dodger organization, I don't care what color he is, he could come play here, and if he's going to help the ball club, that's it. And I think there was like a petition not bring Jackie on, and DeRocha just, those four guys who had signed the petition were gone from the Dodgers, whereas MacPhail in the American League at the same time sent around the memo to all the American League owners saying, we're not going to tolerate this, black people are inferior to whites. We're not going to bring anyone on. He tried to lobby for a consensus against it.
Well, what's interesting, you mentioned Leo being in Jackie's corner, and he was. The Dodgers trained in Cuba in 1947, and Dixie Walker was the ringleader of the players who were against the idea of adding a black player to the Dodgers organization. And Dixie Walker passed around a petition, and a number of players, Kirby Higbee was one of them, a pitcher, who signed the petition. They're going to present it to ownership. And Leo got wind of this and heard about it. And there was a midnight meeting in the clubhouse in Havana. And Leo came down in his silk pajamas, I suppose. I don't know. I wasn't there. And he read the riot act to the Dodger players. Now, this is 1947. Within 2 or 3 weeks, he was banned from baseball for the other indiscretions that we talked about previously. But Leo took a stand, and Leo stood up for Jackie Robinson, who was going to be the first black player in Major League Baseball. And he told his team, I don't care if he's black, red, blue, or orange. He's a hell of a ball player. He's going to put money in your pockets. So cool it and back off, and let's get on with this, So Leo was heroic in that respect. Now, he was kind of a character in many other areas, but as far as the integration of Major League Baseball, Leo DeRocha was a significant character with the Dodgers at that point.
And I loved. Did you pick up Paul Dixon's Leo DeRocha?
Read it from cover to cover.
Yeah, and I've been fortunate to get all the brand new books, including yours. It's amazing, when I think back about Leo, and of course I was born in '70, so by that time he was still with the Cubs. Leo, it's such a contradiction because he didn't like Marvin Mill. He threw him the hell out. He didn't believe in free agency, but yet he stood out of the most to make more on the pension plan than anyone else.
It is a contradiction, but there are a lot of them in the history of our game.
And it's just Leo is such a fascinating character. I asked Paul Dixon in the end, did you like Leo DeRocha? He said no, but he had his good points. Let's go back 37 years. Let's go back to the Chalmers whole affair in 1910. All right, so you said Ty Cobb. He wants to win the batting title that year. What went wrong?
I loved that. That's maybe my favorite chapter in the book because the stuff that went on is just unbelievable. In 1910, the automobile was becoming a major part of transportation in America. And there was a car company called the Chalmers, Chalmers Motor Car Company. And the owner decided a great promotion would be to award a Chalmers car to the leading hitter, the guy who won the batting championship. Now, in the National League, there was a hitter named Sherry McGee, and he had a pretty good season. He hit in the 330s, but that was nothing compared to what was going on in the American League. And Sherry McGee was a little angry because, well, why didn't I get a car? I won the batting championship. Well, your batting championship wasn't as good. The American League batting championship came down to a race between two Hall of Fame players, Ty Cobb and Nap Lajoie. Now, Cobb was an unpopular character in his own clubhouse and around Major League Baseball. I guess partly because of his fiery personality. He would come in spikes high and so forth when he made a slide and stuff like that. So he was not a popular guy. Lajoie, on the other hand, was a very popular guy. So popular, in fact, that the Cleveland franchise renamed its team, called the team the Cleveland Naps, N-A-P-S, after Napoleon Lajoie. Now, these two guys had this great race all season long, down to the wire race to win the batting championship. We come down to the last day of the season. Cobb is sitting out because he claims he has an eye infection. And, he's sitting on whatever his batting average was at the time, which is pretty high. And Lajoie is trailing him going into the last day of the season. They're playing in St. Louis. Cleveland is playing at St. Louis. Meaningless doubleheader. Okay, both teams. St. Louis was terrible, and Cleveland was not in the race. So it was just two baseball games. The manager of the St. Louis Browns was one of many people who hated Ty Cobb's guts. His name was Jim O'Connell. Jim O'Connell. His nickname was Peach Pie. In those days, they had great nicknames also. So Peach Pie O'Connor is the manager of the St. Louis team, and he decides he's going to help Napoleon Lajoie. So he goes to his third baseman, a rookie named Red Corridan, later became a coach in Major League Baseball. And he said, Red, you got to watch out for Lajoie. He'll line drives, he'll knock your head off. So you got to play deep, whenever he comes to bat. And I mean deep, on the skin of the outfield grass. And Red Corridan, being a rookie, says, okay, Coach, whatever you want me to do, that's what I'm going to do. What O'Connor was doing was setting it up for Lajoie to bunt, beat out bunts. Every time you beat out a bunt, that's a base hit. Every time you get a base hit, your average goes up. Beat out bunts. And Lajoie looks down the third base line, and he's wondering, what in the world is this all about? Well, I'm not going to play into this. I'm a major league hitter. So his first time at bat, he hits a long fly ball. The center fielder loses it in the sun, and it falls for a triple. So he's got one hit. Now, the second time up, there's Corridan back on the outfield grass. Lajoie says, well, if you're going to give me bunts, I'm going to bunt. And he bunted 5 more times. He got 6 hits that day and won the batting championship, unless, of course, you consider certain other matters that in 1910, the statistics were not quite as accurate as they are today. They didn't have sabermetrics and analytics and all of that fancy stuff. The statistics were kept with a pencil and an eraser, and so it was decided that Cobb had really won the batting championship by a decimal point. And I should tell you, one of Lajoie's bunts was misplayed by a shortstop, and the ruling in the press box was an error. Well, an error counts as an at-bat and not a hit. So the Browns personnel, Peach Pie, the manager, and his coach, Handsome Harry Howell, was the coach's name, decide, well, they got to get that changed. So Peach Pie sends Howell up to the press box and pleads for the official scorer to change the error to a hit. Well, the official scorer was having none of that. He said, I saw the play, it was an error, and it's staying as an error. Handsome Harry Howell reports back to Peach Pie and says he's not going to change it. So, well, we'll see about that. And they send a messenger, a kid, bat boy, up to the press box. Listen, we'll give you a suit of clothes if you change that to a hit. The official scorer says, no dice, I don't want a suit of clothes, it's an error. So it stayed an error. And when all of this came to the attention of the people who were running baseball at that time, not Landis. Landis didn't come until 1921. But the other people were administering baseball. And Peach Pie O'Connor and Handsome Harry Howell were barred from baseball for life for trying to monkey with the batting averages of Napoleon LaJoie. And so it's one of my favorite stories in the book about how things went on in those days and how hated Cobb was and how beloved LaJoie was and how they would go to any length to try and help LaJoie and hurt Cobb. In fact, when at first it was decided that LaJoie had won the batting championship, a half a dozen of Cobb's teammates on the Detroit Tigers sent a letter to LaJoie congratulating him. So that shows you how unpopular Cobb was even in his own clubhouse. It's one of my favorite stories in the book.
Hal? Now, this is weird. This is very weird. I mean, it was like something like .001 of a point. I think the official stats, which are in front of me, is Cobb had a .385.069 and LaJoie had a .384.095. If you add that up, that's like around .7 of a whole point. When you get to it, that's so minuscule. Why did Chalmers issue both of them?
Chalmers gave both of them cause.
Yeah, why? Why did any research that you did picked up to saying, well, maybe we feel bad for LaJoie, maybe the error
I think
wasn't?
it was so controversial that Chalmers just decided he didn't want any part of the controversy, and he just said, you both get cause. That, of course, made Sherry McGee very angry because he's in the National League, and why can't I have a car, But,
yeah.
it's it's the charm of that time in baseball, which I've always been fascinated by. The
dead ball
time
era.
of baseball was a lot simpler game in those days than it is today.
Well, with all the stuff, and then, by the way, are you still on my Ty Cobb site? Because I put on new stuff every day.
Yes, I certainly am. I look at those pictures all the time.
Yeah, I put stuff on all of that. Speaking of the dead ball era, let's talk about Hal Chase, the Black Prince of Baseball, huh?
What a strange story that is. This is a guy who was considered the greatest fielding first baseman of his time, a defensive whiz, and yet somehow he managed to lead the league in errors every year. Well, wait a minute. How can that be? Well, because he fixed games. And when he fixed games, he made sure that, if a ball was hit to him in a crucial spot, he'd kick it. Or if a throw was made to him in a crucial spot, he'd drop it. So he had a hat full of errors, even though he was a great fielding first baseman. And he was kind of a, carefree guy who liked to play on the dark side a little bit. And he was indicted for fixing games, and he was thrown out of baseball a couple of times. He was a manager of the Yankees briefly. And just a kind of a dark character in the history of the game. And the irony of it is he was a terrific player, but again, in the era in which he played, bribes were everywhere, fixes were everywhere, and Hal Chase partook in all of that stuff, and so he's got a little bit of a black cloud over his reputation, even though he was a really good player.
And it's also strange because again, the dead ball era, as we know, turns into a live ball era almost immediately. It ends with the Black Sox scandal. Did you read Charles Fountain's The Betrayal last year when he published his book on the new stuff that he picked up on it?
No, I did not see that.
He was on my show. It's a great book. It's called The Betrayal. And if you want, I can contact him and he can send you a book because he really gives the testimony of Jackson and all the players that were pretty much coerced. You don't need a lawyer. Just admit it. You know, if I was Jackson's lawyer, I would throw the evidence right out. See you later. You coerced my client, for God's sakes. You know, he asked for a lawyer to say, you don't need a lawyer. You know, and that whole thing, it's such a stew of like, you know, I would say just confusion, because there was one more that got it for just knowing about it.
It's a strange time.
Yeah, Joe Gidgen. He was the one that knew about it, and Landis decided to, hey, you knew about it? Hammer's coming down on you too.
Yeah, exactly. The one victim in all of this, or a major victim in all of this, was Eddie Seacott, who was a terrific pitcher for the White Sox. But Charles Comiskey was probably the cheapest owner in a community of cheap owners, and he underpaid all of his players. And he agreed to a contract with Seacott that would pay Seacott $10,000 bonus if he won 30 games. And Seacott said, great, you know, I can win 30 games. He was a hell of a pitcher. He's a knuckleball pitcher. And he gets to 29, like in the last month of the season, and Charles Comiskey notifies his manager, Kid Gleason, no more Seacott. You don't pitch him anymore. Well, if he doesn't pitch, he can't win. Can't win that 30th game, and he doesn't earn the $10,000 bonus. And this did not amuse Eddie Seacott very much. He was a little angry about all of this. Besides which, he had just bought a farm. He had a mortgage. And so when the gamblers approached Eddie Seacott, even though he was an upstanding character and a very good pitcher, he said, sure, show me the money. And one of the things I'm charmed by is in the opening game of that World Series, there were no certainty about whether these games were going to be fixed or not. The gamblers weren't sure that the players would come through for them. And the tip-off was going to be the first batter in the World Series. And Seacott hit him right between the numbers, and that was the signal that the fix was in. And that's when the money went down, and that's when, well, all of it evolved. And everybody seemed to know that there was a fix. I mean, it was well known in the press box. The great Hugh Fullerton Sr. was the one of the guys in the press box who clearly knew that these players were doing business. Everybody knew. I mean, it was no secret. And you know, it's a really interesting period in baseball history. I'm fascinated by the dead ball era. I really am.
And let me ask you this, Hal. With some of those players who were barred, like Joe Jackson said, well, yeah, I took the money but gave it back, or Cicotti, do you think the time is probably right for these guys to, you know, get their due and say, well, you know what, maybe they weren't as guilty, you know, as the evidence showed. You had evidence that was missing and tossed out. You know, they've been blacklisted enough for almost 100 years. Why don't we just, you know, say the hell with it and put them in the Hall of Fame?
Well, the one guy who really is a victim of circumstances is Shoeless Joe Jackson. Shoeless Joe Jackson was an illiterate. I mean, he could play baseball. He was a hell of a player. Still has, I think, the third highest career batting average.
357, I think, his average was.
Yeah, but he was an illiterate. And he went along with the fix only because he was being loyal to his teammates. He was a great teammate. And if the other players said, we're going to do this, Shoeless Joe said, count me in. But his pure talent took over. And if you look at the statistics of the 1919 World Series, the leading hitter was Shoeless Joe Jackson. So was he fixing games? I don't think so. But, you know, the story from that 1919 World Series that also fascinated me and is in the book, the White Sox had a rookie pitcher named Dickie Kerr. Dickie Kerr had nothing to do with the fix. And in fact, while his teammates were trying to throw games, Dickie Kerr won 2 games in that World Series. That's pretty good, you know, if your team is trying to throw the game and you win 2 games. So Dickie Dickey had his own troubles with Comiskey in terms of salary, and he held out. And Judge Landis came down on him, said, "You're holding out? Fine, go become a plumber. Well, go become a bricklayer. You're out of baseball." And that lasted for about 3 years, and then he was reinstated. But he was no longer an effective pitcher. He wound up being a coach in the St. Louis Cardinals organization, low minors. Like in those days, they had Class D, which was what amounts to the rookie league today. And so Dickey is a coach, and on his team is a left-handed pitcher. Not a bad pitcher, pretty good. But this guy falls on his elbow trying to field a bunt and dislocates his elbow. And in those days, medical science was not quite what it is today. And so he was never really right again. His pitching arm was not good again. And he thought he was through with baseball. He said, "That's it, I'm going to go back to the farm and, use a plow or whatever I do." And Dickie Kerr said, "Wait a minute, you're a pretty good hitter. Why don't we try to make you an outfielder?" So this guy said, "Okay, I'll try anything." He became an outfielder. You know what his name was? Stan Musial. Stan the Man Musial. Dickie Kerr saved his career, and Musial was forever grateful, and he did very kind things for Kerr, like building a house for him later in his life. So, again, that's a charming story. It's not often told, but here was a guy who was involved or peripherally involved with a team that fixed the World Series and became a guy who saved the career of one of the greatest players in the history of our game.
And Sam, even Mr. and Mrs. Musial named one of their sons Dick after Kerr.
Yes, that's right.
And I think during the time, Kerr even allowed Musial and his family to live with him in the winter.
I believe you're right.
And what he decided to do, I mean, he really saw potential. Let me ask you this about Stan the Man. Even though his arm was, hurt after that, he still had a very strong throwing arm from left field.
Yeah, he just couldn't throw strikes. I mean, he had a good, and he played a lot of first base also,
Yeah. But what do you have? Like 1,806 hits away and 1,806 hits while at home. It's crazy.
That's one of the most fascinating statistics in the game. The exact same number of hits on the road as he did at home. It's remarkable.
Hey, and something? I have Julie Musial, who's I think the great grandniece of Musial. She helps me with my Facebook pages. I think for his time, Stan Musial was heavily overlooked because you had DiMaggio, Williams, who would take him pretty much all the, and then comes along, Mickey Mantle, and then, Jackie Robinson. But when you look at his stats, and for the longevity that he played for 22 years, I think, until 63, Stan Musial has to be up in the top 10 of all players of all time.
He played in St. Louis, and even though St. Louis is a great baseball town, it's not New York, it's not Chicago, it's not L.A. It's in the middle of the country, and I think that had something to do with it. Even though the Cardinals were quite successful, they played in many World Series, but it's still St. Louis, and I think that had some issue. That was some issue for Musial as far as gaining the respect and the acclamation that he deserved.
And he was a hell of a nice guy. Clean baseball, In fact, I think in the 1960 season, he was so disappointed with his play the year before, he actually took a pay cut. He actually requested a pay cut.
I think that's true. I think that's a true story, yeah.
But now here's another one from the dead ball era, something close to your heart with Chicago, Dr. Creamer. The
good doctor, the not-so-good doctor. Well, in 1908, one of the most famous seasons in baseball history. That was the season when Fred Merkle, an innocent rookie, made a terrible base running blunder. He neglected to run from first to second base in the ninth inning, and what seemed to be the game-winning hit turned out to be a force-out for the Cubs against the Giants. And this whole mess landed on the desk of Harry Pulliam, who was the president of the National League. He wanted no part of it, but he had to rule, and he ruled that if the season ended in a tie, these two teams would have to play off. Well, it shouldn't have ended in a tie. The Cubs should have won it. The Giants should have won it fair and square. McGraw, the Giants manager, was furious. He said, "We won the game. What are you talking about?" "No, you didn't win the game. It was a force-out. Fred Merkle didn't run from first to second." And, of course, the season did end in a tie. So we had a playoff game at the Polo Grounds, the great ballpark in Upper Manhattan. And in 1908, baseball was just getting its sea legs with the American public. And this race, which came down to the last day of the season and in fact, created a tie and into the postseason, just electrified the country, the fans here in New York, and the entire nation. And the ballpark, which held 55,000 fans, was jammed. There were people spilled into the streets. It was just electric for this playoff game between the Cubs and the Giants. Now, under the stands, there was a meeting between Dr. Joseph Kramer, who was the Giants team physician, and Bill Clem, who was the greatest umpire in the history of the game, and he was going to be the umpire that day. And Dr. Kramer had money in his fist, and he approached Clem, and he said to him, "Make sure the Giants win, and this money is yours." And Clem was just flabbergasted. He was outraged because the amount of money that Dr. Kramer was holding was about $2,500, and that was about the season's salary for most of the players in those days, if you can imagine that. That's like meal money today. But so Clem looked at him and he said, "No, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to take your money. Take your money and put it away." And he reported Dr. Kramer to the commissioner's office. Not the commissioner's office, again, the people who ran baseball in those days. They had a three-man committee. And Dr. Joseph Kramer became the first and only team physician to be barred from baseball. Now, subsequently, it was learned that Dr. Kramer was nothing more than a messenger boy for John McGraw. McGraw was a terrible character. He was a racing aficionado, racehorse owner, and he was a tough guy. He was a tough manager. He was a tough ball player in his day, and the suspicion is that McGraw sent Dr. Kramer on this mission to try and get the game fixed. And Bill Clem was having none of it. Dr. Kramer became the victim of circumstances. He denied ever having said it or ever having done it, but he was barred from baseball, banned from the game for life, the only team physician to earn that distinction.
Let me ask you this, Hal, regarding McGraw. Again, McGraw played in an era, he played in the late 1890s and into the early 1900s before he became manager of the Giants, I think around 1903. He refused to play the American League in 1904. But he came when baseball had all that stuff. Guys running around the bases, you stick your leg out, you trip him, there's no obstruction. They'll pull his belt, trying to hold him back from running any further. Gambling's going on in the stands. All this stuff. I was reading the whole book on Casey Stengel by Marty Appel. I had him on my show. Stuff just went on. But Casey learned a lot of things from John McGraw. And although McGraw was dirty, and although he was probably one of the most unsavory characters of the era, he did have a good baseball mind.
Yeah, without question. The Giants were a powerhouse team in that era, largely because of McGraw and his skills as a manager. And it's ironic. In 1932, Lou Gehrig, the great Lou Gehrig, hit 4 home runs in a game. Now, ordinarily, that's a headline, would you say, on the back page? Gehrig hits 4 home runs. It became an after story because it was the same day that John McGraw retired from baseball as the manager of the Giants. And the McGraw departure became the lead story in the papers that day. So that's kind of funny, I thought.
It's amazing. It's amazing. Now let's go forward and let's talk about George Steinbrenner. And now, so when I ask a lot of people don't know about the whole thing with Watergate. They know about the Dave Winfield stuff. But here's a guy that comes along, buys the Yankees, is thrown out of baseball, and then he repeats the same thing 17 years ago with another branch of stupidity. Let's talk about each incident in the 70s and 90s, and why wasn't he barred for life?
Well, why wasn't he barred for life? I mean, different commissioners have different points of view. And the 2 commissioners who barred George were Bowie Kuhn and Fay Vincent. And they viewed his misdemeanors as serious, but not for life. So he was allowed to come back both times. He came back. And the irony of all of that, I find, is that he remains today a candidate for the Hall of Fame. Well, wait a minute. This is a guy who was thrown out of the game not once but twice. He leads all owners in suspensions from the game. And you're going to put him in the Hall of Fame? No, not in my Hall of Fame, you're not. So he remains a candidate, and whenever they have that Veterans Committee, and they change those rules every year, but I would be outraged to see him inducted into the Hall of Fame.
And you know something, Hal? What's odd is this. Bowie Kuhn banned Steinbrenner for telling his folks who worked underneath him to make contributions to Nixon's re-election campaign. Exactly. Literally, saying, you got to do this. It's, and he bullied people, Steinbrenner, as we know. I asked Peter Golenbach when he was on my show, he's like, did George change when Torrey took over? He's like, absolutely not. You just didn't hear of it because Torrey knew what to do. But let me ask you this question. I'm reading right now the Oakland A's, Jason Turbo's new book, and Charles Finley. I can't begin to tell you how many run-ins he had with Bowie Kuhn. But why do you think he wasn't suspended for the whole Mike Andrews affair in the '73 World Series when, Andrews...
Probably should have been.
Yeah. I'm sitting there...
It's a different perspective on each case as it comes across your desk. I knew Bowie pretty well. Mm-hmm. And he was a kind of an even-handed character. He wasn't looking to make waves. He was certainly in the corner of the owners in terms of the labor relations in the Marvin Miller era. But I think Bowie wanted smooth waters, and you ban somebody for life, that's a serious piece of work. And when he banned Willie Mays and he banned Mickey Mantle, which was kind of foolish on his part, really.
It was. And
it tarnished his reputation because all they were doing was shaking hands in casinos and glad-handing customers. They weren't betting and they weren't leading players to the tables. They were standing in the doorway shaking hands. They were glad-handing. But Bowie took a strong stand. He said anybody who works for a casino cannot be employed in Major League Baseball. Well, that was a mistake on the commissioner's part, and he paid for it. He paid for it because there was a terrible backlash, and the first thing that Peter Ueberroth did when he was installed as Kuhn's successor was to reinstate both Mays and Mantle, and that was a great public relations move on his part because these are two icons of the game, besides which they were both in the Hall of Fame at the time, and it's awfully tough to bar people like that, especially when all they did was shake hands with customers.
That was a tragedy. And remember something. You know, Willie Mays and Mickey Mantle played at a time of the reserve clause. And now, a few years earlier, with Messersmith and Case and now free agents, these guys wanted to make some money. I mean, Mickey Mantle retired. He was penniless from baseball, you know?
That's true. That's true.
Now, let's make some money. And shaking hands had nothing to do with gambling. But I think Bowie Kuhn couldn't see past Major League Baseball Rule 21. I think he liberally utilized that to say that this is a problem. They're still established. They're still interwoven with an established house of gambling, and it shall have nothing to do with baseball. But how many people, bet on the ponies? How many people bet on hockey?
Go to the track. You'll see them all over the place.
They're all there. I mean, everybody has
sure.
recreation. Yeah, everyone. I saved the best for last. Pete Rose. And we're not going to go into what happened and all this because we all know what happened. My question is this for Rose. He accepted a lifetime ban. Now, while maintaining his innocence, as we know, but the thing is, the Dowd report that was handed to Bart Giamatti said that all the records, it had 225 pages and 7 volumes of exhibits, which included bank and telephone records, alleged betting records, and transcripts of interviews with Rose and other witnesses. Now, Rose, 15 years later, says, well, yeah, I did bet on baseball, but I never bet on baseball games that I was involved in, crafting a very fine line between betting on baseball and getting suspended for a year or betting on your own team that you're involved in and getting a lifetime ban. Now, my question to you is this. Why didn't Rose reinstate himself a year after getting suspended? He could have done it in 1990 to reinstate himself after a year, but waited until 92 and 97 to apply for reinstate. And why, if he admits this, why doesn't the Dowd report show that he bet on his own game?
Well, the first part of your question, you have to remember that Rose had income tax issues as well.
Yeah.
And he wound up serving some time for evading taxes. So he had a lot on his plate at the time. Now, baseball wanted to make an example of him. And the first rule in baseball, the cardinal rule in baseball is thou shalt not bet, partly because of what went on in the dead ball era that we've already discussed. So every clubhouse in Major League Baseball has a sign reminding the players and reminding the management, whoever's in that room, don't bet on the games. Don't gamble on the games. And by violating that rule, Rose set himself up as the poster boy for Major League Baseball to hold up as an example of what will happen to you if you bet on games. That said, Rose was barred from baseball in 1989. We're now in 2017. He's a little old guy like me. He's 75, 76 years old, whatever it is. And, people go to jail and are released from jail for major crimes, rape and murder sometimes. And eventually they get themselves released after 25 years. In my mind, it's time for Pete Rose to be released. This is a guy with the most hits in the history of the game. He belongs in the Hall of Fame. Now, he will never get into the Hall of Fame in his lifetime, I don't think, because baseball is a very vindictive sport. And they won't overturn that ban. He's applied countless times to countless commissioners. He applied to Bud Selig a number of times. he's applied most recently to the new commissioner, Rob Manfred, and each commissioner turns him down. So ultimately, at age 75 or 76, he's now been hired by Fox Sports to do post-game and pre-game World Series commentary, and he has a lot of fun with it. He's been paraded out. He's in the Reds Hall of Fame, by the way. The Cincinnati Reds were permitted to put him in their Hall of Fame. He's got a street named after him in Cincinnati, right by the ballpark. So there are things that they're honoring him in one way or another. And each summer at the Hall of Fame ceremonies in Cooperstown, they have the induction ceremony at the Hall of Fame on Main Street, at one end of Main Street. At the other end of Main Street, there's a memorabilia store, and Pete Rose shows up and signs memorabilia at the other end of Main Street on the day of the induction. So it's kind of a statement by him, like, I'm in Cooperstown too. I just don't happen to be at the right end of the street. And in my opinion, and I have nothing to say about it, but in my opinion, it's time to reinstate Pete Rose and give him the proper rewards of a great career that he had. 4,200 and some hits. That's pretty good, you know. So that's my feeling about Pete.
I think I would do that if the Dowd report shows that no game that he bet on that he played in, then it won't show that he had collusion to lose those games or reason to do it. And his bets, because he bet on everything, hockey, horses.
Yeah, he was a gambler.
Yeah, he's a compulsive guy, and you could even go as far and use a psychology report saying, you know, it's a disease and we should excuse his action. Well, not excuse it, but at least show that he couldn't help himself, that he was addicted to gambling. He owed bookies $200,000 at the time. Let me ask you this. With Rose, you know, Manfred opened the door to the Cincinnati Reds Hall of Fame. And, you know what was funny? I had a petition at that time. They were going to vote the Veterans Committee because I'm helping Jenny Paul try to get Gabe Paul into the Cincinnati Reds Hall of Fame because, you know, he was there 24 years. He did a lot of great work, integrated Cincinnati, which was pretty much a racist town at the time. Actually, you know, and he was just a genius, as he was shown when Steinbrenner was sidelined for the 2 years. He built the Yankees in the 1970s, Gabe Paul. But when they were supposed to come up for vote, they said, the commissioner said, hey, Pete Rose. They had the whole ceremony on Pete Rose. So Gabe was pushed back. Let me ask you this. Is there anything that I missed that maybe you would like to say or something that maybe should have been in the book that you would have thought that would have been in there?
You know, deadlines being what they are, at some point you have to press the button and the book is done. But there continue to be players who come along and violate the rules and get themselves suspended and banned. And so far this season, we've had Sterling Marte from the Pittsburgh Pirates. And, of course, we had the Mets relief pitcher, Jeurys Familia, for 15 games. And Marte is, I think, 50 games. So, you know, it doesn't end. It just goes on. And players use PEDs, and players beat up their wives, and players do things that offend the principles of the game. So that'll be in the second edition of Banned.
Well, you know, so and you know, some. Yeah, but there should be. I mean, there's so much more. You know what? AJ Preller, you know, selling a damaged player.
The first general manager to get himself banned. So we have in the book we have the first doctor, we have the first umpire, we have the first general manager, and ultimately we'll have more of all of those categories, I think, because the game goes on and the people come along who want to bend the rules here and there, and so that's what happens.
Let me ask you this. Besides Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and any online place, where can we find your wonderful book? Is it in the bookstore?
I'm told that any bookstore will order it for you.
Oh, great.
But the easiest place to get it is Amazon and Barnes & Noble. blacklist.com.
Yeah, I mean, and, I always tell folks, look, Hal Bock, excellent author, so many years going back. It goes back to 62, 63 when you got out of college, right?
63 was my first year at the Associated Press, yeah. I got out of college in 61, but I had some obligations with the United States Armed Forces, so I didn't get to start writing until 63.
Yeah, well, hold the line, Hal. This is how I ended. Folks, go out, get this book. Hal, I hope you had a great time today because I always have a good time talking with you.
I appreciated being on your show.
Yeah, I hope you thought my questions were thought-provoking and just not the run-of-the-mill, stuff because it was made for everyone to think. But hang the line, hold the line for a sec. Folks, go out, buy this book. Great book. Love Hal. As always, I'm Ian Kahanowitz. Thank you, Hal, for being on the show. In the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow, good night, folks. Good luck. We'll see you next time.
Bye now.